What is your main goal in learning Japanese? Fun and culture, of course. We are men of culture. What level do you want to achieve? Impress my friends by socializing in Japanese. Interesting. I think they should add getting Nihongo Jozu. Bought subscription plan because I want to try everything. Lesson 1. Vocabulary. In our first lesson, let's learn how to greet each other and introduce ourselves. Konnichiwa, hello.
こんにちは。
Ooh, interesting. So I think we need a little more explanation here because we only say konnichiwa around noon. So after morning, before late afternoon. This kind of one word, one definition approach isn't really good, especially with basic words, because basic words tend to have many different meanings and you have to use them in the right context. And these apps don't usually give you enough context to learn words properly.
私はマリコです。
So this is typical textbook Japanese, as I call it. It's grammatically correct, we can understand it, but it's not very likely that we actually say this. And in this situation, introducing yourself, we would probably just say Mariko desu. Because in Japanese, we tend to not say things that are obvious from the context. So if you just show up and say Mariko desu, it's pretty obvious that you are talking about yourself. So you don't have to say watashi wa. And this is one of the most important aspects of Japanese. As you have guessed, watashi means I. So the structure for I am is watashi wa something something desu. This can be a little misleading. Again, Japanese and English are very different languages. So this kind of approach to make you think that you can always translate Japanese sentences almost word by word into an English sentence can be quite detrimental for you to learn Japanese, which is a totally different language.
私はケンです。
This is not a bad question in my opinion because it's just testing if you can make out what he said. How about this one?
はじめまして。私はドラえもんです。どうぞよろしく。
Oh, interesting sentence. So I've always wondered why textbooks and apps teach you どうぞよろしく when this is not the most common way of saying this. It's not wrong, but it sounds a little old-fashioned. In this case, I think we would simply say よろしくお願いします. I think it's better to teach you what we actually say instead of what we don't usually say.
こんにちは。はじめまして。私はミミです。
Yeah, it's kind of weird that she says 私は耳です because it's quite obvious that she's talking about herself from this context. And some people say, oh, this is just to teach you this sentence structure 私は something です. But then, there are actually phrases that we are likely to say in real life that can also teach you this kind of structure. So, in my opinion, it's better to use examples that we actually use in real life instead of something artificial. Matt just met someone in Japan and they want to know his name. What should he say? So let's try a natural version. Okay. I wonder if... Oh, it doesn't even allow you to phrase this in a natural way. So natural Japanese, out. Textbook Japanese, in. And you might think it's not a big deal that you remember this unnatural phrase, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. So imagine what many other unnatural phrases that this kind of app teaches you. But this is not just this app. This approach is very common with all the popular textbooks and all the apps that have this kind of cookie cutter lessons. Let's go to a more advanced lesson. Ready to use some Japanese. こんにちは。お元気ですか? Another example of textbook Japanese. I don't remember Japanese people actually say お元気ですか? It's very old-fashioned. And by the way, when I say textbooks, I mean textbooks for non-native speakers. Because Japanese textbooks that we native speakers use in school, they actually just use real life books and articles, and they don't tell us how to speak Japanese. Their focus is on reading and writing Japanese.
おはようございます。
Formal. Okay. But one thing that's good about this app is it teaches you both like the neutral form and the polite form, which is good because a lot of textbooks don't do this. And that's not very helpful if you want to understand real life Japanese, because real life Japanese people use both neutral and polite forms, and the language itself built on the neutral form. So let's communicate. Greetings.
こんにちは。
Konnichiwa. So just like Duolingo, this app uses text-to-speech software, which isn't ideal. It's better to have an actual native speaker. This is a paid app. I would expect something better from a paid app.
はじめまして。
Hajimemashite.
はじめまして。
And see, their intonation is weird. And remember, they tell you to repeat the sentence out loud, but the model, the example, isn't really that good. So, no, this is not good.
どうぞよろしく。
This sounds very weird, the way she pronounces it.
どうぞよろしく。
I'm not happy that they tried to remember this pretty, I wouldn't say unnatural, but something uncommon phrase. I mean, if you have to practice saying Japanese phrases, would you rather use phrases that we actually use? Or would you rather use phrases that we actually don't use? Ohayou gozaimasu, good morning. In this lesson, we will start by learning the different ways of saying bye. Then we'll learn about the different ways you can say I depending on your gender and personality. This is good. This is good. 楽しいね. Have fun. Wrong translation. So 楽しいね is more like it's fun, isn't it? I think what they meant is 楽しんで. That means have fun. So
さようなら。
さようなら. Sayonara is a very difficult word to use. And honestly, it's actually not a very common word that we use. Because it sounds like you're not going to see this person for a long time. The most common situation I can think of where we actually say sayonara is especially elementary school or maybe middle school. You actually say sayonara to your teachers. And this is a very specific situation where we actually say sayonara. We say sayonara if we are leaving for a very long time, if we are moving to a different country. Okay. We do not use it if we are going to see each other soon. Please don't say sayonara after this lesson. Good point. Okay, let's communicate. In the past few lessons, okay, output stage. Oh, that was lesson 7, and I'm surprised that we actually haven't learned a lot of grammar. So a lot of people misunderstand me because I always criticize textbook Japanese. And I also emphasize that if you want to understand real-life Japanese, the real-life Japanese people speak, it's best to learn from real-life Japanese instead of artificial textbook Japanese. Some people think that I'm saying that you shouldn't learn grammar, but that's the opposite of what I'm saying because adult learners can hugely benefit from learning important basic grammatical concepts. What I'm saying is textbook grammar isn't always based on real-life Japanese. It's often based on their version of textbook Japanese, which is artificial and unnatural. And that's why I will teach you the kind of Japanese that real-life Japanese people today actually speak. So click the link and subscribe to my email group, Japanese with Yuta. Are you Tanaka Sensei? Lesson 14.
マリコさんは学生です。
Mariko-san wa gakusei desu. The subject of the sentence is Mariko-san. The subject. This is a very complicated debate about Japanese grammar. Is this a subject or is this a topic? What do we use after the subject to identify someone or something? This is a very tricky explanation that can be potentially confusing to many English speakers because it's debatable if what the subject of a Japanese sentence. Because wa, like we can use as many wa we want in a given sentence. So if we have multiple wa, which one is the subject? And some people go so far as to say that there's no subject in a Japanese statement. And if you try to understand Japanese the way you would understand English, you will be in trouble. So I'm not sure about this explanation. It can be quite misleading. Select the word that expresses politeness in the sentence. This is fine. This is a polite word. They haven't mentioned something critically important about Japanese, which is, again, when we speak Japanese or even when we write Japanese, we tend to not say things that are obvious from the context. And in this case, this is an independent sentence, so 田中さんは高校生です should be fine. But if we already know we are talking about Tanaka-san, we would just say 高校生です. To make a statement into the question, we'd add ka at the end of the sentence. We do not need to put a question mark at the end of a question when we use ka because it serves as a question mark. Again, this is what textbooks say and it's not wrong. Sometimes we don't use a question mark, but in real life, we use question marks all the time when we use ka. So,
エリコさんは会社員ですか?
And again, so this method or this app is also based on conventional Japanese textbooks. And what they do is when they introduce a particle, they don't actually explain like everything or most thing about a particle. They only explain a very specific aspect of the particle, thinking that, okay, this is what you need to know at the moment. Because even though particles like ka has many important meanings, and you need to know these meanings if you want to understand real-life Japanese. But in the textbook world, they try to just introduce a very, very specific piece of grammar like at the time. Because they pretend as though people who learn Japanese don't really try to understand real-life Japanese. Like until they are at the very, very advanced level according to their textbooks. So they don't teach you many very common expressions, many common words, many common usages of words. That's why you can be studying Japanese with textbooks or like Japanese courses, online and offline for years sometimes, and you still don't understand real-life Japanese because their approach isn't really based on how frequently words and expressions are used in real life. It's based on their like artificial Japanese. And they assume that you don't really consume any media in Japanese, which of course isn't based on reality because a lot of people who want to learn Japanese are already watching anime, they're already playing video games, they're already trying to watch some YouTube videos in Japanese, they are already exposed to real life Japanese. So that's a very different approach from my approach because my approach is based on real life Japanese and I will try to teach you the most common expressions and words and concepts that are very important to understand real life Japanese. So textbooks and apps like this, they always like shield you away from real life language. In Japanese, we rarely use the word you, very true, as it is considered rude. Instead, to address someone, we use their name plus san. If you don't know a person's name, politely ask them お名前は? What is your name? It literally means your name is.
あなた
It is rude to say you. Well, I wouldn't say it's rude. So, あなた isn't necessarily rude. It sounds abrupt and it sounds as though you are like blaming somebody. But I wouldn't say it's rude. And this concerns spoken Japanese. And when we write Japanese, when we write questions, questionnaires, surveys, we actually use あなた. So everything depends on the context. But if you're learning Japanese, it's better to avoid using あなた. So we should always try to avoid it. So I wouldn't say always. See? I don't like using words like this. Always, never. But I would say we should normally try to avoid it. So based on that, I would say false. See? Never say never.
お名前は
お名前はすみません、お名前は This is fine. You might remember that no in Japanese is ie and yes is hi. When responding to a question, we often omit the subject if it's clear who or what we are talking about. There you go. This is important information. I'm glad this app mentioned it.
はい
Hi.
いいえ
We actually don't usually say ie in real life. And this should be obvious if you actually listen to conversations between Japanese people. あ、学生ですか? Yeah. I think I would just say yeah. Yeah or yeah. Yeah, yeah. 先生です. So this is textbook Japanese.
田中さんは医者ですか
何ですか? はい、一緒です. Oh, this approach is better than Duolingo, right? Because Duolingo tries to make you translate. And if you don't come up with the specific translation, Duolingo might not be happy. And translating every sentence is not a good approach when you learn a language. So at least this app doesn't do that. They ask a question in Japanese, and you answer in Japanese. This approach is much better than Duolingo. いいですね. Good. I wonder who wrote these explanations. I feel like they're not really native Japanese speakers. Because the way they use Japanese phrases, like this one, いいですね, doesn't sound very natural to me. Yeah, so in this context, if you want to say something like good job, I think we would say よくできました. I don't think we would say いいですね in this context. Okay, textbook Japanese. Again, I'm not saying learning textbook Japanese is wrong, because I'm very passionate about teaching you real-life Japanese, but I also understand that not everybody cares about learning real-life Japanese. Some people are completely okay with learning textbook Japanese. So it's just a matter of preference, I think. But if you want to understand real-life Japanese, it's much better to use like dialogues that are more realistic, phrases that we actually use in real life. But again, we have very different approaches. Textbook approach or approaches based on real life language. Okay, let's go to a more advanced level. Travels to Japan, lesson 100. Let's try that. Reading. Read the text and test your understanding.
私は4月に妻と日本に行きました。妻は古い町が好きですから電車で奈良に行きました。
ですから. So ですから is actually one of the most overused Japanese expressions with non-native speakers. It's not wrong. We sometimes use ですから, but in terms of the frequency, if you compare how often native speakers use this expression to how often the non-native speakers use this expression, I think we will see a huge difference. Non-native speakers use this expression much more than native speakers because textbooks teach you this expression at a very early stage. And when you do that, this expression will end up sounding natural to you, even though it doesn't always to native speakers in different contexts. And again, I need to emphasize that what's natural completely depends on the context, because at a Japanese diet session, with other politicians, you will speak differently comparing to if you are just talking to your coworkers. So everything depends on the context. 妻は古い町が好きですから電車で奈良に行きました。奈良のお寺で大仏を見ました。すごかったです。公園で弁当を食べました。しかも私の弁当を食べました。しかも私の弁okay. しかも私のInteresting. So if I read this text, I would think that it's written by a non-native speaker. So this is not wrong. I might be a little nitpicky, but the thing is, you can still teach the same thing, the same important concept, words and phrases using more natural sounding Japanese. So as I always say, if I have a choice to teach you a certain concept, phrases, words with unnatural sounding Japanese and natural sounding Japanese, I would rather choose natural sounding Japanese.
公園で弁当を食べました。しかも私の弁当を食べました。
So, しかも, I thought it was しかも. So, しかも, high, low, low means what's more on top of that. Okay? しかも, low, high, high means dear as well. So, completely different. We need kanji to actually express the difference. 京都で有名な神社に行きました。妻は小さい店で綺麗なカバンを買いました。着物は高かったですから買いませんでした。高かったですから。It's grammatically correct, as always, but that doesn't sound very natural. 高かったですから。I don't think most Japanese people would say this. 妻、着物は高かったので。See, this is what I'm talking about. When I googled 高かったですから most of the results are actually from textbooks and Japanese tests. See, this is Quizlet grammar, so it's a textbook phrase. 高かったですから and this is from a test. See, this is a very uncommon expression and most of the results are from textbooks and tests. And see, more than a million results. テンションが高くてね。This is real life Japanese. 高かったんでした。This is from a textbook. Real life food review. Real life Japanese, real life Japanese, real life Japanese. Oh, see? This is what I'm talking about. A lot of phrases that textbooks and apps like this teach are almost exclusively used in the context of textbooks for non-native speakers. So this is an example of artificial, unnatural Japanese.
妻は小さい店できれいなカバンを買いました。着物は高かったですから買いませんでした。
I feel like they're using text-to-speech software that has a pitch accent feature, so they can probably adjust pitch accent, which is better than Duolingo, because Duolingo straight up just give you wrong phrases with the wrong pitch accent. But again, this is a paid app, so I think they should use native Japanese speakers to read these sentences. Let's try the highest level, and let's try the last. Getting married. Wow, okay. Describing important moments in life. Okay. Getting married.
結婚式。結婚式は私の人生で
Sounds quite robotic. Getting married. Dialogue.
あなたのマークが結婚すると聞きました。おめでとう。
Wait.
私は今、結婚式の準備にとても忙しいです。
あなたたちは宗教的な式をしますか？または人前式をしますか？
What kind of conversation is this? It sounds super
でも
unnatural.
私が
心配ないですよ。あなたが夢見た結婚
No,
式になるはず
no,
です。
no. Unnatural.
私は
Whoa, this conversation is super unnatural. I definitely remember that this app told us to never use anata in conversation and just go ahead and use anata like this. Like, what's very inconsistent, very, very inconsistent. And this dialogue is like, it's really unnatural. So it's apparently very difficult to write like natural sounding conversations using specific grammatical points and words. Because the thing is, I also hire native Japanese speakers to write dialogues for my courses. And most people are very, 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 very bad at writing natural dialogues. Like, I'm always like, okay, do you actually say this in real life? Like, do Japanese people actually talk like that? So only the best few % of the people who apply can actually write natural sounding dialogues. So it's actually not surprising that apps like this, who doesn't really make a huge effort into teaching you natural Japanese, like have this kind of super unnatural dialogue. So it's not surprising. Also, this dialogue sounds almost like it's been translated from English. That's probably why it sounds so unnatural. 心配ないですよ。あなたが夢見た結婚式になるはずです。Who says this? It sounds like I'm reading like a Japanese subtitles of a foreign movie. So with Busuu, I can see that they sometimes try, which is good. They have some good information. But overall, their Japanese is mostly unnatural, the usual unnatural textbook Japanese. But it's kind of expected that I don't like apps like this because my approach is completely different. I will teach you real-life Japanese that real-life Japanese people actually speak, and I will explain important grammatical concepts using real-life Japanese instead of artificial textbook Japanese. So click the link and subscribe to my email group, Japanese with Yuta.